We'll move next to a presentation from Co-Executive Director Torres from the Coalition Ending Gender-Based Violence.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Amarinthia. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Co-Executive Director of the Coalition Ending Gender-Based Violence. First, thank you to Chair Rink for inviting me to be on this panel, and to all the council members for prioritizing this important conversation. Today, I'm going to share some context of the gender-based violence movement, then share how local programs in Seattle are being impacted by the federal administration, and then I'll highlight critical ways to move forward together. Our coalition is the collective voice for over 35 member programs, all working to an end to gender-based violence, such as domestic violence, rape, sexual assault, and commercial sexual exploitation. Anytime anyone does not conform to what's expected of their gender, they run the risk of being targets of violence. If a friend or loved one is being controlled by their partner or being harassed at school or online or is forced to have sex when they don't want to, they may need the support provided by a local gender-based violence program. Our mission is one that recognizes three things. One, that rigid gender roles and gender inequity is at the root of most forms of violence. Two, that an antidote to abuse of power is equitable relationships and shared power. And three, that it will take all of us working together to truly end gender-based violence in our communities. Last year was the 30th anniversary of the Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA, bipartisan legislation passed in 1994 that created a unified national response with dedicated resources and funding for survivor services. Now, I was just 13 years old in rural Tennessee in 1994, but I was in my 30s and working at a domestic violence and sexual assault organization supporting queer and trans survivors when the 2013 inclusive VAWA passed in Congress. This critical legislation included specific protections for immigrant survivors, increased access to justice for Native American and Indigenous women, and added gender identity and sexual orientation as protected classes for the first time. The opposition said, we'll pass VAWA, but only if you take all those groups out. And our movement said, absolutely not. And we succeeded in passing the inclusive VAWA, which is still the law of the land today. This is more than just statutory requirements. It is central to our missions and our values. Values that say some survivors have worse outcomes and higher likelihood of abuse because of systems of oppression, such as racism and sexism. Values that assert all survivors deserve safety and dignity as they heal from the impacts of abuse. I decided to share this history with you today because I think it illustrates some of the core values of our movement, and it shows a stark contrast to where we are now at the federal level. We are witnessing monumental abuses of power at the highest levels of government, and the core values and integrity of our collective work to end gender-based violence is under threat. The recent executive order, quote, defending women from gender ideology extremism, is essentially describing patriarchal values and encouraging discrimination. It establishes a binary of two distinct sexes, male and female, attempts to erase the concept of gender, and vilifies gender identity, all in the name of defending womanhood. Over the last 6 months, notices of funding opportunities through VAWA were suddenly removed and then reposted with an entirely new set of requirements, requiring applicants to certify that grant funds will not be used for out-of-scope activities such as promoting gender ideology, promoting illegal DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion programs, violating federal immigration law, and activities that frame domestic violence or sexual assault as systemic social justice issues. There's a lot to say about that, even just that last bullet point, really all of them. I don't have a ton of time to go into that, though I welcome further conversation on this issue. But I did want to note, as Marissa shared earlier, finally, the most recent federal budget request for fiscal year 26 proposes a $128 million reduction to the Office on Violence Against Women. So, what does this all mean for our local gender-based violence programs here in Seattle? On the slide here, you'll see these are all of the member programs that are part of our coalition, and they do incredible, profound work every day supporting survivors here in our communities. A majority of programs, including the coalition, rely on federal funding, whether through VAWA, through VOCA, which is the Victims of Crime Act, or other pass-through funds to meet the needs of survivors in our community. And even with that, we fall short. Here in King County, in the last 4 years, there have been more domestic violence-related deaths than in the previous 10 years combined, with 135 fatalities from 2020 to 2024 alone. Statewide, Washington has a higher prevalence of both domestic violence and sexual assault, though our funding, higher prevalence than the national average, but we continue to see our federal funding get cut. Most notably, since 2018, VOCA, which supports victims of crime of all types, not just domestic violence and sexual assault, but VOCA has been cut by over 75% in Washington. These harmful restrictions on funding, combined with the executive orders, are forcing programs to make impossible choices, deny life-saving services to immigrant and LGBTQ survivors, or get cut off from funding. Many programs have just self-selected out of funding they would normally be eligible for due to this impasse. Additionally, some programs are navigating the precarious position of being out of compliance with VAWA and Congress if they apply, since those laws are still standing. If they opt out of applying for OVW grants, they lose out on critical funding for services that survivors rely on. Yet if they make the required certifications, they will expose their organizations to legal and financial risk. In fact, there's a group of 17 state domestic violence and sexual assault coalitions across the country that have filed a lawsuit about this very issue that we are waiting to hear how that goes. All of this will, of course, impact the sustainability of our local programs and the availability of services to victims and survivors. So how do we move forward from here? I don't pretend to have all the answers to that, but every survivor of gender-based violence faces unique risks and safety concerns as they resist abuse, and so too are we as a movement and as individual organizations facing unique risks and safety concerns right now. I believe the gender-based violence movement should play a vital role in this moment. We know that a primary harm of abuse is an attempt to take away agency and self-determination. We all need to remember our own agency right now in this moment, that we always have choices and that what we do matters. Abuse says nothing you do matters, you're small. But we know it matters when we assert and embrace an expansive and liberatory view of gender. We know it matters when we say all survivors, regardless of immigration status, disability, gender identity, or sexual orientation, deserve safety and dignity. We know it matters when we move through the world standing firm in our values. And as a coalition, this is what we endeavor to do on behalf of our membership. This is also what we need from our local governments. Strong and autonomous local government can help insulate our communities and our values from the encroachment of abuses of power at the federal level. Strong, stable, and fair revenue can help insulate us too. It's really wonderful to hear all the comments from council members today in support of this same ethic and this same role that our local governments can play. It's going to take all of us in ever-widening coalitions, and I look forward to continuing the work together. And I deeply appreciate the time to talk with you today about this issue with you this morning. Thank you so much.
Honing in on one point that you raised, Washington has a higher prevalence than the national average on domestic violence. Did I hear that correctly? And could you expand on that?
Yes, as some of the work, that is correct, you did hear that correctly, and some of the work that our statewide coalition was doing to protect the Victims of Crime Act funding, that was something that emerged from their advocacy efforts, was some of the higher rate of prevalence statewide, and thus the need for additional funds for victims of crime and for gender-based violence broadly, and why it's so stark that we're have seen such significant cuts through the VOCA funds being reduced. But I'm happy to follow up with more specifics through our state coalition if that would be helpful.
Yeah, I'm curious on just like the number, like what is like the numbers attached to those? Do you happen to know those?
I do not happen to have those offhand, but I'm happy to follow up and make sure you have them.
Yeah, that would be great to know. And I think I just have two other points to raise. One, just being a broad commentary. Just I know having worked in the homelessness response system and the clear intersection of work around ending gender-based violence and folks who are actively fleeing and in a number of cases needing to seek homelessness response services. I've come to understand, of course, then the concern that as we cut social services, this further empowers abusers or those who are causing harm, making it harder for folks to be able to leave a dangerous situation. How have you, as working in this body of work, how have you come to understand that dynamic? And do we have any data that signifies how economic downturn can then lead to subsequent situations of gender-based violence or so on? What kind of data do we have on that? Or is there any correlation that you could share?
Absolutely. Such a great question. Thank you, Councilmember Rink. Yes, there's actually a ton of data that shows that homelessness is really that gender-based violence is a leading cause of homelessness among children and families and women that are fleeing abuse. And we know that anything that is in the foundation, in conditions that survivors are navigating, systemic oppression, economic injustice, poverty, we know that so many of those things are power imbalances that are reflected in our society, that those power imbalances are the exact things that folks who are abusive or causing harm, that they can use and leverage that power imbalance to continue to further harm people. And so any kind of lack of access to resources, when survivors are struggling to pay bills or struggling to meet their basic needs, that just makes it all the more easier to exploit them or to have power over them. There is some really helpful data, I think, on a lot of these areas around the ability for financial empowerment and the need for stable financial resources and the economic issues that you're pointing to through much of the Housing First data that really speaks to that intersection of homelessness and housing and survivors of gender-based violence. And that's a really meaningful data and research that actually happened right here in Washington State and has really led the way on much of the national response to prioritizing housing first for survivors of domestic violence. So I would point you to some of that data and can additionally follow up more specifically about that.
Thank you for that. And my last question is just for any survivor who may be listening or anyone who is seeking support or help or knows someone who is seeking support and help, what advice would you give them? Is there a number they should call, or what kind of message would you want to send to them right now?
Yeah, well, thanks for that, Councilmember. I think that I would absolutely point them to all the member programs here that support our community and support survivors. There is a DV Regional Hope Line, DV Hope Line that exists 24/7, multimodal, multilingual chat phone, that is housed by New Beginnings. And there are so many culturally specific supports and programs for folks. We've got programs that are supporting our queer and trans survivors. So I would really encourage folks to reach out to all of these programs that are available, that understand abuses of power, and can help point people to the right resources and get them connected. And at the end of the day, support their own efforts and their own self-determination for what they know they need and for safety that they may be trying to access. Mm-hmm. Thank you for that.
Thank you.